back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow, as we continue our coverage of the shocking revelation of the draft Alito opinion on reproductive rights. A number of questions are raised, including who will be criminalized if, or should we say when, that ruling becomes the law of the land. Here to discuss that with us now is Rafa Kidwai. Rafa is the director of the Repro Legal Defense Fund at If, When, How. They are a queer Muslim abolitionist and a member of the Queer Crescent Board, and very active, of course, as you might assume from their bio, in this field, doing a lot of important work. So first of all, Rafa Kidwai, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Richard.
Let me start, Rafa, with the question that I've had for a number of people on and off the air since this opinion was released. How shocked were you by it? A little, a lot, somewhere in between? What, if anything, surprised you about it?
You know, it's one of those complicated situations where you expect something to come. We knew that we were expecting difficult news, and at the same time, nothing prepares you for the feeling of hearing it. It's also unprecedented. You know, to be clear, it's a leaked opinion, so it's not the final order. And of course, till we see a final opinion, we know abortion is legal in the United States. But still, it's extremely disturbing. It's unprecedented. Not just the substantive part of the decision leak, but also just that it was leaked in the first place. And so a lot to grapple with.
One of the areas that your organization deals with a lot, and I mentioned this in my introduction, there's so much we can talk about with this subject. It's so broad and impacts so many people. One of the things that your work focuses on, as I understand it, your organization's work, is the criminalization of reproductive rights, the criminalization of abortion. If that's correct, I guess one place to start is how will that change the criminalization of bodily autonomy when it comes to reproduction, should this opinion become law? Where is that criminality state now, and where might it be should this become a ruling?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Just for some background, I think throughout the world, people have been self-managing their abortions for as long as pregnancy exists. And today, more people in the United States are ending their own pregnancies at home without involving a healthcare provider. And it's partially because it's significantly safer to self-manage your abortions with the advent of medication abortion pills. So everyone should be able to choose the abortion that works best for them, right? Whether it's with the provider at a clinic or whether it's self-managing at home. And the methods are varied, whether it's pill abortions or herbs. And the medical risk is not what we're concerned about, unfortunately. We're concerned actually with a legal risk. Mm-hmm. So in this country, people have been unjustly criminalized for self-managing their abortions or for their pregnancy loss. And those are concerns that are absolutely amplified in this moment. We're concerned that people are, because of a lack of access to clinical care, or just because it's the safest, best method for them. I mean, if you think about trans people and their distrust and understandable, valid distrust of the medical system, one can imagine that someone would want to self-manage their abortions with supportive care at home, where they feel safe. And so for a plethora of reasons, I think we're going to see people needing to and wanting to self-manage their abortions. But
please go ahead.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, and I was going to say, all of which highlights for me the fact that anybody out there who, I would think specifically men and perhaps, men in positions of some privilege or whatever, who thinks this is not about them, that it seems to me that not that this should be the central issue, but a core issue here is that women's bodies, trans bodies, reproductive rights, these seem to me, and I'm not a lawyer, they seem to me to exist at the intersection of so many fundamental human rights, the right to privacy, the right to guide your own medical care with appropriate, input from experts and so on, that it seems to me as if this is like the tip of the spear for a massive invasion of all our bodies, and that once again, women, trans people, other vulnerable groups are being, I don't know, targeted.
Targeted, yeah.
Yeah. And do you agree with that interpretation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think one needs to be a lawyer. One needs to be a person who is living in this country that is committed to the subjugation of certain bodies, and specifically marginalized bodies. It's built on the control of Black bodies, Indigenous bodies. And I think we're just seeing the extension of this historical control of bodies here. What we're seeing with anti-trans legislation is exactly the same sort of rhetoric and the same impetus to control bodies and not let people make decisions around their bodies themselves. And then I think in turn create an extreme amount of stigma around people as they make decisions around their own bodies, medically appropriate decisions around their own bodies. And that stigma is what really concerns me, I think, because I think it then creates this narrative that abortion is wrong, that making decisions about your body yourself is wrong, and therefore worthy of criminalization, therefore worthy of state intervention. It just feels like the state is looking for a way to make decisions about pregnant people and prevent them from making decisions for themselves. And you're right that the people that are harmed are absolutely Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, immigrants, poor people, women, trans people, people with disabilities, all the people that the state wants to control. This is a manifestation of that. You're absolutely right.
And it seems to me that the stigmatization, Rafa, it seems to me that it takes multiple forms depending on who the audience is, because I think the people who want to exert their own power over the bodies of others have been very sophisticated and dedicated to doing this. And so it seems to me, one of the things I wanted to explore with you is, and there are many, but one of them is that if you're appealing to, let's say, a conservative, rural, white, Christian voting bloc, you might take one approach is ungodly, it's taking a life, it's whatever. But I also think there's a more subtle way in which this is directed against what might be described as more liberal voting blocs as well. For example, I know your work involves, in many cases, self-managed abortions, and I think a lot of people who consider themselves politically liberal have come to believe that the very notion of self-managing an abortion is dangerous, reckless, irresponsible, and that even though they might identify as somebody who supports reproductive rights, it would be, oh no, you can't do that. Just as we criminalize drug abuse, we have to criminalize a self-managed care in this area. Do you get what I'm driving at? And do you think there's any validity? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is a lot of stigma around self-management. I think people have been convinced that it's nervous making, that it's unsafe medically, and that's just not true. It's safer than aspirin, for instance. But I think that it does create this kind of feeling that that someone is doing something wrong when they take a decision into their own hands. But if you look at self-managed abortion, under the pandemic, for instance, the FDA allowed you to, through telehealth, speak to a provider who could then send you medication for abortions. And in practice, the experience is exactly the same, right? Medically, it's exactly the same. You're taking this medication at home. You've been given instructions for how to assess your own risk. And then if you need medical intervention, you should be able to go get it. But unfortunately, what we see then is that when people do feel that they need medical intervention, they're nervous after they've self-managed, for instance, they end up going to their medical providers to make sure that they're okay, but those same medical providers then report them. And that's obviously not something that medical providers should be doing, but also not something that people expect their medical providers to do. And I think that's a really dangerous thing when the people that you turn to for your safety end up being the people that report you to the police. Again, that's what I mean by the legal risk is greater than the medical risk in this situation, right? And I think that I think you're right that self-management gives people the impression that it's unruly or like dangerous or something, but people have been self-managing their abortions since the beginning of time. The regulation of these things is obviously in the history of humanity a fairly recent phenomenon, and the goal is for people to be safe. I mean, I want people to be safe. I want people, when they self-manage, to be able to trust that they can talk to their medical providers, and unfortunately that's just not something people can rely on.
And Rafa, let's talk a little bit about that inability to speak to the medical providers. My understanding is that is largely because a number of states have passed laws requiring medical providers to report certain self-managing activities to the police or the authorities. Is that correct?
I think that there is a gross misunderstanding of what the law requires of medical providers. And I don't think that, I think you should turn to doctors that are talking about this specifically and what their requirements are. But I think that there's generally a gross misunderstanding about what people should be doing. And I think what doctors should be doing is keeping their patients safe.
Well, of course, but I guess the question is, certainly I'm capable of gross misunderstandings. So, please let me know if I'm wrong. But my understanding, there must be some reason why people believe that they can't speak to their providers about this, and why people are in danger. Is it ideological on the provider's part? Is it? And I know I actually will bring some providers in to talk about it. But when you deal with people who have been run afoul of the law for self-managing an abortion, what's the experience generally that brought them to this point?
Can you say that a different way? Like, what would make someone self-manage?
No. I mean, if they do self-manage and they find themselves in trouble with the law and they need the help of the Repro Legal Defense Fund, what are the sequences of events that get them in trouble with the law? Yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you for restating that. So I think that the medical providers absolutely report people, and that's one of the ways that people are reported. I also think that there's generally, there's politically motivated police and prosecutors that misuse criminal laws to target people who self-manage their abortions. And Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, other people of color, people who are struggling financially, immigrants, young people have it really hard in this country. Trans and non-binary and gender expansive people are basically just more likely to be targeted and criminalized by all institutions. Certain people and their bodies are viewed as suspicious. Pregnant people, if they're Black and brown, face a lot of stigma and presumption about whether they're adequately caring for themselves. I think that, medical providers are not immune from racism. Sure. And so we know that the medical industry, on a related note, under-medicates certain communities because they don't presume that they experience pain the same way. And that's obviously about a racism within the medical complex. And so I think the sequence of events is basically white supremacist, racist institutions targeting certain people, presuming they're suspicious. For instance, we know that medically, whether you had a pregnancy loss because of a miscarriage or whether you had a medical abortion, providers, there's really no difference medically. And so when you get medical care, you don't actually need to tell your provider that you self-managed your abortion, for instance, because in practice, it's the same experience medically. And so I think whether someone is presumed to have done something to quote unquote, something wrong, quote unquote, is really about the person who's viewing them as suspicious or worthy of criminalization. And so I think that's often the entry point.
And how do you suppose that this might change assuming that the Alito opinion becomes established law, you're describing a terrible situation as it already exists. How would you see this opinion as law altering that?
I mean, it's terrifying what I think is going to happen in terms of overarching culture. This decision is obviously incredibly dangerous. Abortion access has been systematically under attack in this country for decades. I think politically motivated police and prosecutors will continue to prosecute people in increasing numbers, most likely. So, the Repro Legal Defense Fund where I work is a bail fund, but we're also a legal defense fund. And so if you are arrested, investigated, prosecuted for self-managing abortion, we can help. And we can provide financial assistance to people who are criminalized for self-managed abortion and pregnancy loss, assist with their fees, etc. And when we started the fund about a year ago, we kind of knew that there was we already knew that there was criminalization, regardless of Roe, but we also knew about these growing attempts nationally to criminalize pregnant people, and we knew that they were going to get worse, which is kind of where we started, right? Like, how was I surprised? On the one hand, it's always shocking, but on the other hand, I've been preparing for this for a year and I still was shocked, And we basically knew that the cost to people's lives was going to be unfathomable. So let's say someone is arrested and we can advocate for charges against them to be dropped. What's happened till that point is already devastating for someone. Sure. So as a former public defender, I can say when someone is arrested, if it's a media case, which often happens in our cases, you have someone's mugshot that's just used over and over again. The journalists write these awful pieces about the people that are arrested. Bail is hugely expensive for people, and people are pooling their resources together to get this person out of jail. And jail is obviously cruel and violent and disgusting, and not a place for anybody, and certainly not a place for someone who's experienced pregnancy loss imminently. We saw the cost of litigation pulls people's resources away from their families, and then pulls people away from their families. Then there's child welfare implications, where the child welfare, I say in quotations, where the family regulation system comes in and then says, let's separate you from your children. And then you have to fight on that front. And then, I think one of the things that I'm concerned about is this culture of, I don't know if you're from New York, but in New York, we have MTA, see something, say something. It's kind of the vibe that I feel is going to happen, is that people are just being asked and corralled to report people. And so it means that you're suspicious of your neighbors, and that's dangerous. Community is what we know keeps us safe, not the state, and certainly not state surveillance. And I think that even though, with SB 8, and we're talking in Texas, we're talking about civil situations where anyone can report you, who's to say, and who I think will most likely report people will be abusive partners or abusive family members. And so I'm really, really concerned about survivors of intimate partner violence at this time. Another group of people that I think might choose to self-manage for their own safety, understandably. And so I think generally what I'm seeing and what I'm expecting to see is that more and more people will need to and will choose to self-manage abortion. And more people will be criminalized for that. And so at this point, I think, and the cost to people will be financially devastating, because criminalization is intentionally expensive. It's not an accident that bail is high. It's not an accident that legal fees are high. And then I think we're just going to see emotionally, we're just traumatizing people at a time that maybe they're already traumatized, right? Like, by the time you get reported by a provider, how many systems have failed you? So I think that's what I'm imagining, is just a culture of fear, a culture of criminalization, a culture of surveillance, and all of these things sever our communities. They don't help build them up.
And I just want to take a moment with the audience really to process the enormous sense of invasion and pain that must come along with, first of all, being it would feel like a betrayal to me. I would think that to be reported by your own medical provider, that's an intimate relationship. And then to be forced into the criminal justice system, so-called, for of a deeply personal decision, and then to face all these financial and legal and public social consequences and everything else. It just, I mean, I think it's important for all of us to register how devastating that is. And if you throw on top of that, expansion of what the law we see in Texas that you just described, where anybody can report you, we're really talking about, this word is overused, but we're talking about a kind of fascist, this is what, when we were kids, we were told was so terrible about, East Germany or whatever, the totalitarian state, Nazi Germany, whatever, that it's absolutely horrifying. And I just wanted to, excuse me for that, Rafa, but I just wanted to take a second. I had to process it myself. No, I mean, you'll need more than a second to process, and I take your time with that. It's actually so huge. It is so huge that we have created a culture where, it's accepted that you just hand control of your body over to the state. And that's a fundamental value that I think I hold as bodily autonomy. And the state is telling you that they would like you not to have that, and they will use their full strength and capabilities to make that happen if you don't comply. That's huge. And then I think that, go ahead. They'll do nothing for you if you're poor or disadvantaged in any way to help you with the child, that they want to force you to bear. They'll leave you to your own devices to try to survive in many ways. And of course, the same people pushing this are the people who are trying to strip whatever minimal protections people have financially to raise children in this society. So it just strikes me that, dark days, but Rafa, I don't want to focus on dark days, because I know you guys are as tough, as much as we do have to process this. I know you guys are doing important work, and that work will become increasingly important. So I guess I want to ask you, how does the Repro Legal Defense Fund, help people in a position like this? Yeah. Yes, we can both hold the dark days and also hold that we have been preparing. And I think people need to know that there are people that have been preparing. So the Repro Legal Defense Fund, you can find us, contact us through our website, reprolegaldefensefund.org. And the way that you reach out to us is either, if you have an attorney, they can fill out a form and contact us for financial support from bail through the end of litigation, through maybe any potential appeals. And then if you're directly impacted, you can sort of contact us through a different mechanism, a different form, and we'll follow up with you. And we'll just try to sort of fill the gap between what someone's legal defense is and what their needs are. And so whether that's, like I said, I've mentioned bail, so we're happy to fund bail, but also I think that there are so many costs of litigation that are very specific to self-managed abortion criminalization cases. So the use of medical experts, forensic pathologists, really assisting attorneys to provide people with all the tools that they need to fund not just any defense, but a bomb-ass defense, right? Like, I want people to have the best defense they could possibly have. We have a lot of resources internally at If, When, How, both from our litigation team, our policy teams, and our organizing folks that work within the movement, where I think we have a lot of expertise about what putting up a strong defense looks like. And so making sure people know what they need, what lawyers need in order to fight their cases. And then, in our experience, we've provided things that I think vary in terms of whether people consider them essentially part of a defense or not, but I do, which is making sure you have a social worker and a counselor. You've just spent a lot of time in a very violent space after a multitude of systems have failed you. You've experienced interpersonal violence, state violence. How does someone grapple with that, right? And so making sure that people have that support.
Also housing. As a former public defender, I can say that sometimes judges are reticent to release people if they don't have housing, because they want to confirm that you're going to come back to court is the alleged reason. And so if that's what the court is saying, fine, we'll find you housing, if that means that you're more likely to release someone from jail. And so I think helping attorneys to relitigate bail conditions, to fight back with the court at different junctures and say, okay, if this is a question of resources, maybe if we help you bridge that gap, the court is less likely to be able to say anything at that point, right? They can, but I think it would be harder for a court to say, well, it's just the very fact of your homelessness, because the previous reason was we need a way to contact you. Cell phones are another reason, making sure that our clients have cell phones so that, again, no one can say, we have no way to contact you. How do we know you're going to come back to court? Well, okay, now you do have a way to contact this person. And so I think covering a range of potential legal fees, obviously on a sort of case-by-case basis, but still, I think we are really able to help people get the quality of defense that they need, a defense that's trauma-informed, a defense that centers the person's needs. For instance, people often forget that if you're criminalized, that your biggest fear if you're an immigrant with status that would make you deportable, that deportation is your biggest fear, or that you have children. If you're criminalized for self-managed abortion, the biggest fear for someone is, I'm going to be separated from the kids that I do have, that I want to raise, that I want to be better prepared to raise.
Right.
And so making sure that people understand that we are listening to what their biggest concern is in that moment and helping support them in that area. And so we also do some legal fees and funding for people in the child welfare and immigration contexts, should they need it.
Well, it's all fantastic work. And I'm so glad you mentioned the emotional support and the housing and social issues, because it seems to me that's such an essential part of this. So before I let you go, where can people go to find out more about your work and what you guys do?
Thank you for letting me plug our website. So reprolegalDefenseFund.org. You can also find us on Twitter at ReproLegalFund or Instagram at ReproLegalDefenseFund. And then, of course, you can always go to the If When How website, where we have other resources too. So there's a Repro Legal helpline that you can get advice from. It's an incredible resource. There's also a JB Wiki page, which is a page for people who need judicial bypasses or information about judicial bypasses. You can get that on the ifwhenhow.org website also. And yeah, just thank you so much for having me, for creating space for this conversation, and for being thoughtful about this time that we're in.
Well, thank you so much for the great work you do. Again, my guest has been Rafa Kidwai. Rafa is the director of the I just have the shortened version for the Reproductive Legal Defense Fund, Repro Defense Legal Defense Fund at If When How. Thank you for the wonderful work, and thank you for coming on the program.
Take care. Have a lovely day.
You too. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is Zero Hour.